Hello, RCIA folks. Since we cannot meet currently because of the coronavirus and everything else that's going on, I decided that I would start doing some videos on the different topics that we still have left to cover, and that'll keep us more or less on track. Obviously, we're already 2 weeks behind, and the two lessons that we've missed are the moral life and the consistent life ethic. And this week's topic is Catholic social teaching. And I decided I'll start with this week's topic and then we'll kind of backtrack and talk about the consistent life ethic and moral life, which are all of these three topics are very much connected to each other. Really, you can kind of do them in any order. And normally, you might start with moral life because moral life has to do with the individual and the individual choices we make, how we foster virtues in our lives. Those are those habits that help us grow towards holiness, and how we combat vice, how we refrain from sin, how we respond to the sin in our lives. And so it makes sense to start with yourself right before you start to look at society as a whole. But it's really important to remember that as a church, we not only are concerned about the individual's choices and the individual's holiness, but also the wholeness of society as a whole, right? So anything that inhibits that wholeness is a concern of the church. Christ came to be the Savior of the world, which includes all the individuals in the world, but also the world as a whole. And so when we talk about those things, we are talking about Catholic social teaching. And the ideas behind Catholic social teaching are all really based around a few fundamental principles. And the first one of those, and perhaps the most important one, is one that we've talked about several times in class before together. It's taken from the Bible, very first book, Genesis, right? Yep, Genesis, very first chapter too. And in the very first chapter of Genesis, we've read this before together, God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. So that very last part there about God creating humankind in his own image, that's what we call the fundamental dignity of the human person. And that's also the fundamental concern of Catholic social teaching. We as human beings, each of us are part of the human race, and the human race is created in the image of God. There's something about us inherently that is part of us, that is us, that reflects the image of God. And out of that comes our sacredness. And so anything that violates that fundamental dignity is an affront to God. Right? And so God created us in his image, and that's where our worth comes from. Right? Our fundamental worth does not come from what we do, what we've achieved, our level of productivity for society as a whole, our level of satisfaction with ourselves or our happiness. All of those things are good and important, and they have something to do with who we are. But fundamentally, who we are and where our worth comes from is from the fact that we as human beings have been made in the image of God. And anything, like I said before, that violates that, any situation, any action that attacks who we are and how God made us, is a concern to the church. And so when we talk about all of that, something that often comes up is this idea of social justice. Right? And social justice tends to be thrown around this idea of reform, which is a very big part of it. And sometimes you hear just people on one side of the political spectrum, right, who are the social justice warriors, and you think of them as people who are fighting for the cause of the needy, of the poor, of the afflicted, at the expense often of those who have something. Right? And it's not all wrong, but it's also not what the church means entirely when we talk about Catholic social teaching and social justice. Right? Because first of all, we need to think about what is justice. A pretty basic understanding of justice is to give to each what they are due. And then to give to each according to what they need, or to give to those who are in need, that would be considered mercy. Right? If you see someone who is in need of something and you say, I can help you, here you go, that's an act of mercy. That's the mercy that God gives us as well. So looking at those two terms, justice and mercy, we need to ask ourselves, let's look at, for example, at Robin Hood. Was Robin Hood a man of social justice? Well, no, he wasn't, right? He wasn't a man of social justice because there's nothing just about stealing from somebody, right? That's not giving to each according to their due, right? It's taking from someone what was theirs and giving it to somebody else whose it is not, right? It might be an act of mercy, but still he took from somebody whose it isn't. And stealing from somebody is also violating the dignity of that person. So that's where, when it comes to social justice, we need to consider, well, what is justice, right? And what is it not? Now, the reason why concerns about poverty and such are concerns of justice is because we as Catholics, when we look at stories like in the first and second books of Genesis, the first and second chapter of Genesis, we're looking at the original state, right? We talk about original sin. Well, before original sin, we had original holiness, right? And original justice, and there was an original state of things being how they should be, right? Everything was rightly ordered. And then through our original sin and through any sin, we throw off that order. And we, as a human race, have committed actions and have put ourselves into situations that are no longer in accord to that rightful order, and therefore they threaten or they violate the fundamental dignity of the poor and of the vulnerable. And we as a church need to respond to that, because we know that that is not the creation that God has for us, and that is not the creation that Christ came to maintain. Right? He came to restore our creation to what it is meant to be. So, with all of that said, now, what does the church actually teach about social concerns? Well, the church has been teaching about social concerns from the very beginning. Right? If we read about in the Gospels, we see Jesus speaking about his concern for the poor. Right? Even before Christ came, when we look at the Old Testament, we see God consistently advocating for the poor, for the widow, for the orphan, and for the stranger, right? Which are the three most vulnerable populations at the time: the widow, the orphan, the stranger, and making laws that even include the rights of those people, to say, even if you're in these situations, God cares about these people. And so the society that is organized according to the law also needs to care about these people. Right? So our teaching really goes back a long, long way. But the thing about teaching and social situations, social teaching, is that it depends on the social situation in which you're in, how you live out those teachings. The fundamental truths are the same, right? The idea that we are created in the image of God, and that we are social beings. All of those truths continue to be true. But what's different is that the situations change, right? And we now are in the modern or somewhat postmodern era, and so we are we need for our society a church who speaks about the modern issues to us in a way that we can understand it, right? And so a lot of times when we talk about Catholic social teaching, we actually mean modern Catholic social teaching, which goes back to about 1891. In 1891, in that time frame, there was a lot of social reform happening in Europe and in the US, having to do with the rights of workers. And Pope Leo XIII was actually received quite a bit of pressure about, well, how's the church going to respond to these questions of, do the workers have rights? What do those look like? What does this have to do with our faith? And it was kind of a different issue than it had been before, with the way the world was organized, right? And so Pope Leo XIII thought about this in a great length, and ultimately he wrote an encyclical which is called Rerum Novarum. And Rerum Novarum was, what it did was it showed the history of the church's concern for social issues. And that writing was so influential that ever since then, every decade or 20, 25 years, depending on when we're talking about, the current pope will write another encyclical about social concerns, and a lot of those are actually named based on the fact that they're an anniversary. So you have the 40th anniversary, the 100th anniversary of the writing of Rerum Novarum. So Rerum Novarum really started a new era in the church's concern for social issues. Now, the way that these encyclicals work is they'll take an issue of the given time and they'll comment on that social issue and that social concern based on a few fundamental Catholic principles, right? And they'll illuminate the issue, not so much as the left says this and the right says that, but what's the aim, what's the goal that we're going for as Catholics? And so we learn to understand the crux of the issue of it, whatever social concern we're talking about, from the perspective of these fundamental Catholic principles, and then that informs how we as a church respond to that issue. So let's take, for example, questions about labor, questions about work, and the labor movement, right? And questions of different solutions to injustice or inequity in the relationship between workers and capital and those who own capital, right? The wealthy, I guess, whatever that is. But the owners of the capital and the labor force in any industry, any productive society. That was actually a big concern it still is a big concern, but in John Paul II's day, for example, in the 80s, he wrote a 90th anniversary encyclical on Rerum Novarum, which was called Laborem Exercens, and it had to do with the dignity of work. And there, the fundamental principle that he focused on is the one that we've already touched on, which is the fundamental dignity of the human person. And you say, well, what does that have to do with workers' rights, right? Well, he focused on work as being instrumental to our the plan that God has for us and the way God designed us as human beings. So again, we're talking about original justice, right? Original holiness, the state before original sin. And even in that time, man was created to work. Humans were created to work. God says, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, right? So subduing the earth being fruitful is it's not an arbitrary command. It's a command for us, created in the image of God, to do what God does, which is to create, right? To multiply, to subdue, to have dominion over the world, and to make something new out of that by exercising our strength, our knowledge, our wisdom in the world, our efforts. We actually become co-creators with God. That is part of what it means to be made in the image of God, is to exercise that ability and that right to work. Right? So work, whatever labors we do, is actually the subject of mankind. Right? We as humans aren't the subject of work. And a lot of times, if you think of factory workers, it kind of looks that way. Right? You as the human are doing your menial task in order to fulfill the work that your supervisor is asking of you. And Pope John Paul II pointed out that no, actually, capital, the product, is always secondary to the concerns of the producer, of the worker, right? And at the same time, the capital is not insignificant, right? What is produced is part of that co-creation that we are doing, right? And so work and the worker and what they produce, and those who oversee them, or those who own what is being produced, right, are actually all they're not meant to be in a fighting relationship. They're meant to be working together, right? And so in the encyclical, in Laborem Exercens, that's the approach that John Paul II takes to illuminate how should we react to issues of workers' rights and those kinds of things. Right? So you see how the teaching takes a fundamental principle, the human dignity, right, applies it to a certain situation, and rather than trying to say, well, only these people are right or only those people are right, they say, well, what's our goal, right? And our goal is to participate in creation as workers for creation, and it redefines our relationship, right? So that's a lot of times how these encyclicals work, is that they take an issue and they inform us on, here's what the church teaches, and let that inform how you respond to the issue. Right? Now from there, you have these encyclical and say, well, that's fine, right? What are you supposed to do with that encyclical now that we have it? And that really depends on which level of society you're in, right? The idea is not that the Pope gives each of us an instruction on how to respond to our own problems, but he gives us a guideline, a basis from which we make our decisions. And then in every part of the world, in every community, the community needs to come together and say, okay, well, here's the problem in the world as a whole, but here's the problem in our community, right? And how do we respond to questions of workers' rights and the capital versus labor concerns in our factory or in our community, in my company, right? So all these things work at a macro level, but they also significantly have to work at a micro level as well. The concerns mentioned in these encyclicals varies greatly. Dignity of work is a big one. You might have heard Pope Francis, he had an encyclical called Laudato Si on care for our common home, care for the environment, right? There have been encyclicals on international relations as well, and questions on, how do we respond to the Cold War? What about this whole capitalism versus communism thing? there have been encyclicals on those things based on the same kind of arguing from fundamental principles idea that really show us, well, how does the church deal with larger social issues? And in those, we have some fundamental principles, the first of which we've already talked about, which is the fundamental dignity of the human person. And I'd like to go through now and address some of the other fundamental principles of Catholic social teaching.